What most people misunderstand about empaths is this: they don't lose themselves because they love too much. They lose themselves because they were never taught that loving yourself is love. We live in a world that rewards the person who stays, who absorbs, who shows up even when they're running on empty. And somewhere along the way, that person, maybe you, started mistaking exhaustion for devotion, started confusing self-abandonment with loyalty. But here's the truth that changes everything. Peace is not the absence of caring. Peace is the decision to stop bleeding for people who never asked you to. The moment an empath chooses peace, real, unshakable, soul-deep peace, is not a moment of giving up. It is the most powerful act of self-reclamation a deeply feeling person will ever make. Because you were never meant to carry everyone. You were meant to be moved, not consumed, connected, not controlled, present, not dissolved. And today, we're going to talk about what that moment looks like, what it costs, and exactly why it is worth every single second. Think about the child you once were. Not the version of you that learned to cope, learned to manage, learned to hold it all together, but the version of you before all of that. The one who felt everything so deeply that a raised voice in another room could ruin your entire day. The one who could walk into a space and immediately sense when something was wrong, even when every adult in the room was pretending everything was fine. That child was not broken. That child was extraordinarily attuned to the world around them. But that child was also placed in environments, homes, classrooms, family systems that had no language for what they were experiencing. And without language, without guidance, that sensitivity got shaped into something it was never meant to become. It got shaped into a survival strategy. Here's where it starts for most empaths. It does not start with a dramatic moment. It starts quietly in the small everyday dynamics of early life. You notice that when you made someone else comfortable, the tension in the room dropped. You noticed that when you stayed quiet, an argument didn't escalate. You noticed that when you gave your attention, your energy, your emotional labor, the people around you seemed more stable. And stability felt like safety. So your nervous system made a very logical, very human decision. Keep doing that. Nobody had to tell you directly. Nobody sat you down and said, your job is to manage the emotions of the people around you. It was absorbed. It was learned through repetition, through consequence, through reward and withdrawal. You learned that your peace was less important than keeping the environment calm. You learned that your needs created problems, but your helpfulness created connection. And connection, for a child, is survival. This is the part that most people skip over when they talk about empaths. They focus on the gift, the sensitivity, the depth, the ability to understand others, without acknowledging the conditions that taught many empaths to weaponize that gift against themselves. Because that is exactly what happens. A natural ability to feel deeply gets fused with a belief that feeling deeply means you are responsible for everyone around you. That your sensitivity is not just a way of experiencing the world, but an obligation to fix it. And so the pattern gets built layer by layer, year by year. You become the one who listens, the one who stays calm when others fall apart, the one who checks on everyone but never asks to be checked on. You become incredibly skilled at reading what other people need and increasingly disconnected from what you need, not because you are weak, not because you lack boundaries in some moral or personal failure kind of way, but because from a very early age, your belonging was tied to your usefulness. And belonging is not something any human being is wired to risk. This is crucial to understand because without this understanding, empaths spend years blaming themselves. They think, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep giving too much? Why can't I just stop? And they treat it like a character flaw rather than an adaptive response. But there is a massive difference between a flaw and a pattern. A flaw is something wrong with who you are. A pattern is something that was learned, which means it can be unlearned. It means there was a logic to it. It means you were not crazy. You were responding to your environment in the most intelligent way you knew how at the time. But here is where it gets complicated. The environment changes. You grow up, you leave the house, the classroom, the family system that required that version of you. And yet the pattern does not automatically leave with you. Because patterns do not live in places. They live in the nervous system. They live in the way you automatically scan a room when you walk in. They live in the way your body tenses when someone around you upset, even if that person's emotions have absolutely nothing to do with you. They live in the way you feel guilty for resting, the way you feel selfish for saying no, the way you find yourself over-explaining, over-apologizing, over-accommodating, not because you chose to, but because it happens before conscious thought even catches up. This is the invisible weight that so many empaths are carrying, and they are carrying it into friendships, into romantic relationships, into workplaces, into parenting. And every time they sacrifice their peace to keep someone else comfortable, the original lesson gets reinforced. Every time they swallow what they actually feel because the moment doesn't feel safe enough to be honest, they are telling their nervous system the same thing it learned in childhood. Your peace is less important than everyone else's comfort. And the devastating part is that it often works. People do stay when you make yourself easy. Relationships do feel smoother when you never push back. Social situations do stay conflict-free when you absorb tension instead of expressing it. So the reward system keeps firing, the pattern keeps being validated. And somewhere underneath all of it, the empath keeps getting quieter and quieter inside. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have been conditioned not to say it. What makes this even harder to see clearly is that empaths are often celebrated for this exact pattern. You are called the strong one, the reliable one, the one who really gets people. And those labels feel good. They feel like identity. They feel like love. But there is a difference between being appreciated for your genuine presence and being valued for your constant availability. One fills you, the other drains you. And when your entire sense of belonging is built on being useful, on being needed, on being the emotional backbone of every room you walk into, you begin to lose track of who you are when nobody needs anything from you. That is the quiet crisis at the center of this. Not a dramatic breakdown, not a single moment of betrayal, just a slow, steady disconnection from yourself. A growing distance between the person you perform for the world and the person who is still sitting quietly inside you, waiting to be allowed to exist. And this disconnection does not happen because empaths are naive. It does not happen because they lack intelligence or self-awareness. It happens because the conditioning ran deep. It happened early. It was reinforced consistently, and it was wrapped in love, or at least what was presented as love. When the people who were supposed to make you feel safe were the same people whose emotional stability required your self-erasure, it becomes almost impossible to separate love from self-sacrifice. They begin to feel like the same thing, and that confusion does not just disappear in adulthood. It follows you into every relationship where you feel the pull to give more than you have, stay longer than you should, and explain yourself to people who have already decided not to hear you. This is not about blame. Not toward the parents, the teachers, the family members who shaped these early environments. Most of them were operating from their own unhealed wounds. And not toward yourself, for responding to your environment in the most human way possible. This is about seeing it clearly, really clearly, because you cannot change a pattern you have not named. You cannot heal a wound you keep explaining away. And you cannot choose peace, genuine, lasting, unshakable peace, while you are still operating from a belief that was handed to you before you were old enough to question it. The belief that your worth is tied to what you give. The belief that needing something makes you a burden. The belief that the safest version of you is the quietest one. These are not truths. They are old instructions. And the most important thing you will ever do is learn to tell the difference. Because the moment you can see the pattern for what it actually is, not a personality trait, not a spiritual calling, not evidence that you love more deeply than other people, but a survival strategy that outlived the environment that created it, everything begins to shift. Not all at once, not without resistance, but it shifts. And that shift begins not with changing what you do, but with finally asking what you actually feel. There is a question that most empaths have never been asked directly, and it is the question that changes everything once you sit with it honestly. The question is this: when you show up for someone, when you feel what they feel and move toward their pain, are you doing it because it's a genuine expression of who you are, or are you doing it because something inside you cannot tolerate the discomfort of not doing it? That question is not an accusation, it is an invitation. Because the answer to that question is exactly where the line between real empathy and emotional self-erasure lives. And most empaths have never been taught to look there. Genuine empathy is a capacity. It is the ability to sense, understand, and connect with another person's emotional experience without losing your own. It is a bridge between two people, one that allows you to feel with someone while remaining grounded in yourself. Real empathy has a quality of choice to it, a quality of presence. You are moved, but you are not swept away. You are connected, but you are not fused. You give because giving feels meaningful, not because withholding feels unbearable. Emotional self-erasure looks almost identical from the outside, but from the inside it feels completely different. It is not a choice, it is a compulsion. It is the feeling that you must fix what someone else is feeling, that you are somehow responsible for their emotional state. That if someone near you is suffering and you are not doing something about it, you failed. Not just as a friend or a partner or a family member, but as a person. That distinction right there between capacity and compulsion is the one that most conversations about empathy completely miss. And because it gets missed, empaths spend years believing that the most exhausting parts of who they are represent the deepest parts of who they are. They believe that the constant scanning for other people's moods is just how sensitive people experience the world. They believe that the inability to rest until everyone around them is okay is just what deep love looks like. They believe that absorbing other people's pain is the price of being someone who genuinely cares, and none of that is true. But it feels true because the line got blurred so early and so completely that they stopped being able to feel the difference. Here is how to understand the difference in a way that actually lands in the body and not just in the head. Genuine empathy expands you. When you show up for someone from a real place, when you sit with a friend in their grief, when you hold space for someone who is struggling, when you offer your presence without an agenda, you might feel tired afterward, but you do not feel emptied. There is a sense of meaning in it, a sense of having been fully present for something that mattered. You gave something real, and it came from a real place inside you. Emotional self-erasure depletes you in a different way. It is the exhaustion that comes not from giving, but from performing, from managing, from monitoring. You are not just present with someone, you are working to keep them stable, to prevent their discomfort, to manage the emotional temperature of the entire interaction. And when it is over, you do not feel the quiet satisfaction of having genuinely connected. You feel hollowed out, resentful sometimes. And then guilty for the resentment because you chose to be there, didn't you? Except it never really felt like a choice. That guilt is important to pay attention to. Because resentment in an empath is not a sign of selfishness, it is a signal. It is the nervous system's way of communicating that something was taken, or more accurately, that something was given from a place of depletion rather than abundance. And the reason empaths feel guilty about that resentment is because they have confused the two things. They have fused self-erasure with love so completely that pulling them apart feels like a betrayal of who they are. This confusion gets reinforced in the language we use culturally. We talk about love as selflessness. We celebrate the person who gives without asking anything in return. We frame healthy boundaries as coldness and emotional restraint as maturity. And for an empath who already felt too much, already cared too much, already gave too much, these cultural messages land like confirmation. Yes, this is what love looks like. Yes, this is who I am supposed to be. Keep going. But selflessness without self is not love. It is disappearance dressed up as devotion. Real love, the kind that is sustainable, the kind that creates genuine connection rather than quiet resentment, requires a self to give from. It requires that you remain present inside the experience, not dissolved by it. It requires that your care for another person does not come at the cost of abandoning your own emotional reality. Because when it does, what you are giving is not fully love. It is anxiety management. It is people-pleasing with a generous face. It is the frantic, exhausting work of keeping everyone okay so that you can feel safe. And this is not a moral failure. Please hear that clearly. This is a psychological pattern that formed in the gap between deep sensitivity and inadequate support. The empath felt everything, but nobody taught them how to feel without being consumed. Nobody showed them that you can care about someone's pain without taking ownership of it. Nobody modeled the difference between compassion, which stays grounded, and enmeshment, which loses its edges. Enmeshment is the word that lives at the center of this. It is what happens when the boundary between your emotional experience and someone else's becomes so thin that you can no longer tell where they end and you begin. And for many empaths, enmeshment does not feel like a problem. It feels like connection. It feels like the deepest form of closeness they know. Because in their formative experiences, closeness and enmeshment were the same thing. Real intimacy always came with emotional merger. Love always meant feeling everything the other person felt, carrying what they carried, shrinking yourself to make room for their experience. So when someone suggests that there should be a boundary there, that your emotions and someone else's emotions are separate things, that you are not responsible for regulating another person's inner world, it does not just feel unfamiliar. It feels wrong. It can feel like abandonment, like coldness, like the opposite of the kind of person you want to be. That resistance is worth sitting with rather than pushing through. Because underneath it is usually a very old fear. The fear that if you stop merging, you will stop mattering. That if you stop absorbing, you will stop being needed. That if you stop giving yourself away, people will finally see that you are not actually enough. And that fear is not about the present relationship or the present moment. That fear is a memory. It is the nervous system replaying the original lesson. Your worth lives in your usefulness. Your belonging depends on your sacrifice. Healing this does not mean becoming less sensitive. That's another thing that gets misunderstood. The goal is not to feel less. The goal is to feel clearly, to develop the capacity to sense what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else, and to make a conscious choice about what you pick up and carry. To be able to say, I see your pain, I care about your pain, and your pain is not mine to fix. To be able to be moved without being managed by it. That is what genuine empathy actually looks like when it is healthy. It is not distance, it is not detachment, it is full grounded, present-hearted connection with a self still standing inside it. The kind of connection where you can give fully because you have not already given yourself away before you even walked through the door. The difference between empathy and self-erasure is not about how much you feel. It is about whether you are still there when the feeling is over. Nobody warns you about what the breaking point actually feels like. The world has a very dramatic idea of what it looks like when someone finally reaches their limit. A fight, a breakdown, a door slammed hard enough to shake the walls. But for most empaths, it does not arrive like that. It does not announce itself. It does not come with a clear moment you can point to and say, that was it. That was the thing that broke me. It comes quietly. It comes in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. It comes when someone asks you for something completely reasonable, something you have given 100 times before, and for the first time in your life, you have absolutely nothing left to give. That moment is terrifying for an empath, because the one thing they have always been able to do, feel, give, show up, absorb, suddenly fails them. And when the mechanism that built your entire sense of identity and belonging stops working, it does not just feel like exhaustion. It feels like identity collapse. This is what makes the breaking point so difficult to talk about honestly. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, like coldness, like the empath finally becoming the selfish person that a small, critical voice inside them always feared they were. They stop responding as quickly. They start cancelling plans. They go quiet in conversations where they used to carry the entire emotional weight. And the people around them, the ones who have grown comfortable with the empath's constant availability, often respond with confusion or worse, with guilt tripping. And the empath, already fractured, absorbs that too, adds it to the pile, wonders what is wrong with them for finally falling apart. But here is what is actually happening in that moment. It is not weakness, it is not failure, it is the body and the psyche doing the only thing they can do when they have been systematically overridden for too long. They stop, forcibly. Not because the empath chose to stop caring, but because the system that was running on override has finally hit its absolute ceiling. This is not collapse, this is revolt. And there is a profound difference between the two. Collapse is passive, it happens to you. Revolt is the self fighting back, It is the deepest part of who you are, the part that has been silent for years, maybe decades, finally refusing to be silent anymore. And it does not always speak in a language that is easy to understand at first. It speaks in numbness, in sudden, inexplicable anger, in the desperate need to be alone, in the tears that come for no reason you can name while you are doing something completely mundane. These are not signs that something is going wrong. These are signs that something is finally going right. The self is re-emerging, and re-emergence is almost always uncomfortable before it is liberating. The anger piece is particularly important to understand because anger in an empath is often the most misread signal there is. Empaths are not supposed to be angry. That is the unspoken rule they absorbed early. Their job was to soften things, smooth things, make things easier for everyone else. Anger was the emotion that created the tension they spent their whole lives trying to dissolve. So when anger surfaces at the breaking point, real, raw, unpolished anger, most empaths immediately turn it inward. They make themselves wrong for feeling it. They call it ugly. They apologize for it, suppress it, or direct it at themselves in the form of shame. But that anger is not ugliness. That anger is information. It is the emotional immune system doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is the psyche drawing a line and saying this far and no further. Anger in this context is not aggression. It is boundary. And for someone who was conditioned to believe that their boundaries were inconveniences, the arrival of genuine anger can feel like meeting a stranger, one who is loud and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. The numbness is the other side of that coin, and it tends to scare empaths even more than the anger does, because empaths define themselves by their ability to feel. Feeling deeply is not just something they do, it is something they are. So when the numbness sets in, when they find themselves sitting across from someone they love and feeling nothing, when the things that used to move them no longer register, it can feel like a kind of death. Like the most essential part of who they are has gone offline. What is actually happening is protective dissociation. The emotional system, overwhelmed beyond its capacity to process, has done the only thing it can to prevent total shutdown. It has gone quiet. This is not permanent. This is not the empath becoming cold or dead inside. This is the psyche creating a temporary buffer, a moment of stillness, so that healing can begin without the constant interference of everyone else's emotional noise. The numbness is not the end of feeling, it is the space between one way of feeling and a healthier one. And in that space, something important becomes possible for the first time. Clarity. Because when the noise finally drops, when the empath is no longer managing everyone else's emotions, no longer performing okayness, no longer running the endless internal calculations of how to keep every person in their life comfortable, they can finally hear themselves. Sometimes for the first time in years, sometimes for the first time ever, that clarity is often the most disorienting part of the breaking point. Because what they hear when the noise drops is not always what they expected. They hear how exhausted they actually are underneath the function. They hear the grief of all the times they abandoned themselves to keep the peace. They hear the needs they never voiced, the things they wanted but never asked for, the version of themselves that got quieter and quieter until it was barely a whisper. And hearing all of that at once is not comfortable, but it is honest. And honesty, even when it's painful, is always the beginning of something real. This is why the breaking point, as devastating as it feels from inside of it, is actually the most important moment in an empath's life. Not because pain is good, not because suffering is necessary for growth in some performative motivational sense, but because this moment is the first time the empath's internal reality has been allowed to take up more space than everyone else's. This is the first time the signal from inside is louder than the noise from outside. And that reversal, that shift in signal direction, is the exact mechanism through which change becomes possible. Before this moment, the empath could see clearly what everyone else needed. After this moment, they begin to see clearly what they need. Before this moment, the most dominant voice in their life was the collective expectation of the people around them. After this moment, something quieter but far more important starts to be heard. Their own voice, their own truth, their own body telling them, without apology, what it can no longer carry. The mistake that many empaths make at this juncture is trying to get back to who they were before as quickly as possible. They treat the breaking point like a malfunction rather than a message. They apologize for falling apart. They push themselves back into function before they have actually processed what happened. They go back to giving before they have figured out why they stopped. And in doing that, they miss the entire point of what the moment was trying to show them. The breaking point is not asking you to go back. It is asking you to go forward into a version of yourself that is no longer built on self-erasure, that is no longer defined by what you can absorb, that no longer measures its worth in how much it can give before it breaks. It is asking you to use the clarity that arrived in the silence to build something different, not a version of you that cares less. A version of you that finally includes yourself in the circle of people you care for. The breaking point is not the ending of who you are. It is the doorway to who you were always meant to become. There is a story that gets told about peace, especially to people who feel deeply. And it goes something like this. Choosing yourself means you have stopped caring about others. That drawing a line is the same as turning your back. That protecting your energy is just a sophisticated way of being unavailable. And for an empath, that story is not just wrong. It is the exact story that kept them stuck, kept them giving from empty, kept them mistaking self-destruction for love. So let us dismantle it completely, because choosing peace is not the absence of emotional intelligence. It is the fullest expression of it. Emotional intelligence is a term that gets used loosely, so it is worth being precise about what it actually means in practice. It is not the ability to feel more than other people. It is not sensitivity as a performance. It is not knowing exactly what to say to make someone feel better in a difficult moment, though that can be part of it. At its core, emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage emotions. Your own first, and then in relation to others. That sequence matters enormously. Your own first. Because you cannot accurately read what is happening in someone else's emotional world if you are completely disconnected from your own. You cannot offer genuine support from a place of depletion. You cannot be truly present for another person when every resource inside you has already been allocated to keeping them comfortable. This is why choosing peace is not a retreat from emotional intelligence. It is the activation of it. It is the moment the empath stops operating on instinct and conditioning and starts operating from genuine awareness. Awareness of what they actually have to give. Awareness of what the relationship actually requires versus what anxiety is demanding. Awareness of the difference between responding and reacting. That shift from reaction to response is one of the most significant moves a human being can make, and it is impossible to make while you are running on fumes. Think about what it actually takes to hold real space for another person, not perform space, not the anxious, hypervigilant monitoring that empaths often mistake for support. Real space, the kind where the other person feels genuinely seen without being managed, heard without being fixed, present with someone who's fully there. That quality of presence requires groundedness. It requires that you are anchored inside yourself while you reach towards someone else. And you cannot be anchored in yourself if you have abandoned yourself in the process of showing up. The irony is sharp and worth sitting with. The empath who gives everything, who sacrifices their peace entirely in service of others, often ends up offering the least genuine form of connection. Because what they are offering is not grounded presence, it is anxious performance. And people feel the difference, even when they cannot name it. Inner power for an empath is not what culture typically sells. It is not dominance. It is not the ability to shut emotion off and make purely rational decisions. It is not the hardness that gets mistaken for strength in a world that applauds people who do not need anything. Real inner power for a deeply feeling person is the capacity to stay connected to yourself while remaining open to others. It is the ability to be in a difficult conversation without losing your footing, to hear someone's pain without absorbing it as your own responsibility. Say something true even when the truth creates discomfort. To remain emotionally present without becoming emotionally consumed. That is not soft, that is extraordinarily difficult. And it requires something that most empaths have to consciously build because it was never modeled for them: the practice of self-awareness as a daily non-negotiable act. Self-awareness in this context is not navel-gazing. It is not endless introspection that keeps you so focused on your own inner world that you become unavailable to others. It is the simple, consistent practice of checking in with yourself before, during, and after interactions, asking, what am I actually feeling right now? What do I actually have available to give in this moment? Am I showing up from a genuine place, or am I showing up from fear? Is this boundary coming from clarity, or is this withdrawal coming from exhaustion? Those questions are not selfish. They are the foundation of every honest relationship you will ever have. Because here is what inner power actually looks like in practice. It looks like being in a conversation where someone is pushing against your boundary and staying calm. Not because you have suppressed what you feel, but because you are grounded enough in what you know to be true that their discomfort that does not destabilize you. It looks like saying no, a clean, complete no, without a paragraph of justification, and being able to sit with the discomfort that follows without immediately moving to repair it. It looks like recognizing when a relationship is asking you to be less than you are, and choosing yourself anyway, not with bitterness, but with clarity. It looks like being able to receive someone else's anger without immediately taking responsibility for it. That one is significant for empaths because absorbing someone's emotional state feels so automatic that it takes real, practiced awareness to interrupt it. To be able to sit across from someone who is upset and say internally, I see that you are in pain and I am not the cause of it and I am not the cure for it. That is not coldness. That is one of the most emotionally intelligent things a human being can do. It keeps the relationship honest. It keeps you intact. And paradoxically, it keeps the other person from being robbed of the opportunity to process their own experience. There is something else that inner power does that rarely gets talked about. It changes the quality of what you attract and what you tolerate. When an empath is operating from depletion, giving to earn love, staying to avoid abandonment, shrinking to keep the peace, they tend to draw in dynamics that confirm the original wound. Relationships where their giving is taken for granted. Situations where their needs are consistently treated as secondary. Patterns that feel familiar even when they feel terrible. But when the empath begins to operate from inner power, when they show up grounded, when they communicate clearly, when they hold the line without apology, everything shifts. Not because they change the people around them, but because they change the signal they are sending. And different signals draw different responses. This is not magical thinking. This is behavioral reality. The way you present yourself in a relationship, whether you collapse your needs immediately or hold them with confidence, whether you communicate from anxiety or from clarity, whether you stay past your limit or honor it, directly shapes the dynamic that develops. You do not get what you deserve in relationships. You get what you demonstrate you are willing to accept. An inner power is the capacity to demonstrate something different. Not through force, not through walls, but through the quiet, consistent act of valuing yourself as much as you value the people you love. Choosing peace, then, is not a passive act. It is one of the most active, courageous, emotionally intelligent decisions a deeply feeling person can make. It requires going against decades of conditioning. It requires tolerating the discomfort of disappointing people who were comfortable with your self-erasure. It requires grieving the version of connection you were taught to want, the enmeshed, merged, frantic kind, and building an appetite for something steadier, something more honest, something that does not require you to disappear in order to belong. And it is worth saying plainly, this is hard, not because empaths are weak, but because the pull of the old pattern is powerful. Because the nervous system moves toward the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. Because there will be moments when choosing peace feels like choosing loneliness, and you will need to stay in that discomfort long enough to discover that the loneliness is temporary, but the self-respect is permanent. Real emotional intelligence is not knowing how to make everyone around you feel better. It is knowing how to stay true to yourself while still caring deeply about others. It is the wisdom to understand that your peace is not the enemy of your love. It is the foundation of it. And inner power is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling everything and choosing yourself anyway. Something profound and disorienting happens when an empath finally stops overgiving. And almost nobody talks about it honestly. Everyone talks about the freedom that comes with boundaries, the lightness that comes with letting go, the peace that arrives when you stop carrying what was never yours to carry. And those things are real, but they do not arrive first. What arrives first is a silence so unfamiliar it feels like something has gone wrong. A stillness that the empath does not quite know what to do with. Space where all the noise used to be, the managing, the monitoring, the endless emotional labor, and now there is just quiet. And in that quiet, the most important question of their life begins to surface. Who am I when I am not needed? That question is not a small one. For someone who built their entire identity around being the person who gives, who stays, who holds it all together, the absence of that role does not feel like relief right away. It feels like loss. And that loss is real and it deserves to be named, because you are not just releasing a behavior when you stop overgiving, you are releasing an identity. A way of moving through the world that, however exhausting it was, however much it cost you, also gave you something. It gave you a sense of purpose, a sense of being necessary, a sense of place in every room you walked into. And when you put that down, even by choice, even with full awareness of why, there is grief in it, genuine grief. And rushing past that grief, pretending it is not there, is one of the most common mistakes people make in this transition. The grief is not a sign that you made the wrong decision. It is a sign that the old identity mattered to you, even when it was hurting you, and you are allowed to mourn something that needed to end. You are allowed to feel the loss of the version of yourself who always had a reason to be needed, always had a role to play, always knew exactly what their value was in any given relationship. That version of you was not a lie, it was a strategy. And strategies that kept you safe for a long time deserve a proper goodbye, not just a swift deletion. But here is what begins to happen on the other side of that grief if you stay with it rather than running back to the familiar pattern. You begin to meet yourself. Not the self that performed for everyone else, not the self that was shaped by other people's needs and expectations and emotional demands. The self that was always there underneath all of it, quiet and patient and waiting. The one that has preferences you've never fully explored because you were always too busy attending to everyone else's. The one that has opinions you rarely voice because keeping the peace felt more urgent than being honest. The one that has needs, real legitimate human needs, that you spent years convincing yourself were too much, too inconvenient, too selfish to express. Meeting that self is one of the strangest and most beautiful experiences of a human life, and it does not happen in a single moment of revelation. It happens slowly in small accumulations. It happens the first time you say no and do not follow it with an apology. It happens when you sit in silence instead of filling it with reassurance. It happens when someone is uncomfortable and you resist the pull to fix it, and you discover that the discomfort passes and the relationship survives and you are still standing. It happens when you make a decision based entirely on what you need rather than what everyone else expects, and the sky does not fall. These moments are small, but they are seismic. Each one is a data point that rewrites the original story. The story that said your needs were a burden. The story that said your worth lived in your usefulness. The story that said love required self-erasure. The identity shift that happens through this process is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming someone whole. There is a difference. Becoming someone new implies that who you were is being discarded, and that framing creates unnecessary shame and discontinuity. What is actually happening is integration. The sensitivity remains. The depth remains. The capacity for genuine care and connection remains. In fact, it deepens because it is no longer contaminated by compulsion. What falls away is the fear underneath the giving. The anxiety that drove the overfunctioning. The belief that you had to earn your place in every relationship by never having needs of your own. What replaces it is something quieter and far more stable. A sense of self that does not depend on other people's approval for its existence. A way of being in relationships that is chosen rather than compelled. A kind of presence that is genuinely generous rather than frantically accommodating, because it comes from fullness rather than from the desperate need to be needed. And this changes everything about how the empath moves through the world. It changes how they enter conversations, no longer scanning immediately for what the other person needs, but arriving as themselves first, present and grounded, and then extending from that place. It changes how they handle conflict, no longer collapsing at the first sign of someone's displeasure, but staying in the discomfort long enough to speak honestly. It changes what they are willing to tolerate, not because they have become hard or closed, but because they have developed enough self-respect to recognize when a dynamic is asking them to disappear and enough courage to refuse. Protecting your peace after this shift does not look like building walls. That is the image people reach for, and it is the wrong one. Walls keep everything out, the bad and the good, the harmful and the nourishing. What the empath builds instead is discernment. The ability to feel the difference between a relationship that asks them to show up fully and one that asks them to show up empty. The ability to distinguish between genuine connection and the familiar, comfortable pattern of being used. The ability to be warm and open and deeply present without being porous, without letting every emotional current in the room pass straight through them and take something on the way out. Discernment is not coldness. Discernment is wisdom, and it is earned. It is earned through every moment of staying with the discomfort of the transition instead of retreating to the old pattern. Through every conversation where you told the truth instead of managing the atmosphere. Through every relationship you let change or end rather than preserving it at the cost of yourself. Through every time you chose the quiet of your own integrity over the noise of someone else's approval. There is something that needs to be said about the relationships that do not survive this shift, because some of them will not. And that is one of the hardest truths of this entire journey. Some connections were built entirely on the empath's willingness to give without limit. They were not mutual. They were not honest. They were comfortable arrangements where one person's needs were consistently centered and the other person's needs were consistently deprioritized. And when the empath stops agreeing to that arrangement, not with anger, not with ultimatums, but simply by changing how they show up, those dynamics have nothing left to stand on. Losing those relationships hurts, even when they were unhealthy, even when they were costing you more than they were giving you, because they were familiar. Because history creates attachment regardless of quality, but what becomes possible after that loss is something those relationships never could have offered. Connection that is real. Relationships where you are known rather than just needed. Where your presence is wanted rather than just useful. Where you can be fully yourself, sensitive and strong, caring and boundaried, deeply feeling and deeply grounded, without having to choose between your authenticity and your belonging. That is the life waiting on the other side of the identity shift. Not a life without depth or feeling or connection. A life with more of all three. Because now it is built on truth instead of performance, on wholeness instead of function, on the radical and quietly revolutionary decision to include yourself in the love you have always been so generous with giving away. You spent years being everything for everyone. Now it is time to finally be something for yourself and discover that in doing so, you do not become less. You become more than you ever allowed yourself to be.